Hello, Galcron here, hello. So we are on Hercules, and we are going to jump in to the first labor. Originally, there was to be 10, of Hercules. There were supposed to be 10 labors to cleanse his soul of the supposed murder of his wife Megara and children. But again, we know that was not Hercules himself. It was Hera's curse upon Hercules. Cursed with madness, rage, delusion, illusion, and all that sort of stuff. But regardless, it's called the 12 labors of Hercules. And once we get through it, we're going to find out why 10 turned into 12. So we have the first labor, the Nemean lion, which is one of the coolest. This opening task of the assigned 10, like I'd said, was by way of warm-up. Hercules had merely to kill a monstrous lion and bring the pelt to King Eurystheus. In later labors, Hercules would deal with creatures this fearsome as mere incidents along the way to fulfilling the primary task, which is kind of hilarious now that it's, put in such a way, in such terms. One task winds up being later on, okay, in the 8th labor, you just encounter that level of fierceness and difficulty on your way to doing an actual labor. For example, it will be seen that at one point Hercules ambushed and beat up Thanatos, death himself, the embodiment of death, the act of death, okay, is Thanatos. And that task was not even on the mission specification. He did that for his friend, that was king, Admetus, and to get his queen back. So it's kind of cool that Hercules could do such a thing for a friend and was actually successful at wrestling Thanatos and getting the queen back, and so king and queen stayed alive. Another example of the physical strength of Hercules to wrestle such a being, the embodiment of death itself, Thanatos, and not to mention wrestling skill. We'll throw that in there for good measure. So, and that task, it wasn't, the task wasn't a specification at all. He did it because he was friends with the king. So dealing with a man-eating lion was indeed a gentle warm-up for the labors, especially as Hercules already had a decent track record in that department, as the grateful inhabitants of Cithaeron mountain range could testify, because that was the first lion that he killed, of Cithaeron. Admittedly, this particular lion was a substantial step up from Hercules' earlier effort. The beast was no ordinary carnivore, but a child of Typhon and Echidna. Get used to those two names, because Hercules has killed a lot of their children, Typhon and Echidna. They were brother and sister, had a lot of monster children. Hercules killed a lot of them. The Nemean lion is one of them. To put the lion in perspective, a quick introduction to the parents is necessary. Yeah, I can agree with that. Typhon was one of those proto-monsters who had almost managed to destroy the cosmos, which is true. He was somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 feet tall. I've read different things, like he was 2,000 feet tall and had wings, and he had the 100 dragon heads from his shoulders and 100 snakes in his lower body, and breathed volcanic fire and all this kind of stuff from his mouth and all that kind of stuff. He was said to stand half as high as the stars. So again, in feet, I don't know. Is that 5,000 feet? 2,000 feet. It's somewhere in there. And had 100 dragons' heads where the normal human cranium would be. Zeus had attempted to go one-on-one with Typhon and had been soundly defeated, which we can get into that at a later time. In the end, it took the combined effort of all the gods to bring Typhon under control. Well, here's the thing. It wasn't really all the gods. Really, it was more... I mean, the gods planned it, but really it was Hermes and his son Pan who, actually got Zeus's muscles back in the container from Delphine, and then went to Zeus in a cave, and Hermes was like, just sew him back in, and then Zeus would take some time to heal those muscles into place before he went and fought Typhon again and defeated him. And even then, Team Olympus almost lost the battle. Though the Typhonian menace had ultimately been contained, you can't kill him. Typhon's immortal. Any child of the super monster, of Typhon and Echidna, which is the mother, deserved more than a modicum of respect. As for Echidna, the lion's mother, was known as the mother of all monsters. And with such to be described, no one does the job better than Hesiod. Here's a stitch for, again, what I consider the authority on Greek myth is Hesiod's theogony. Here's a stitch. Ferocious Echidna, the goddess. She is half a nymph with fair cheeks and a shy glance, and half a huge and awesome snake with speckled skin. Within the sacred earth, she gnaws on raw flesh in a deep hallowed cave within the rock. She has been granted this glorious dwelling here, far from the immortal gods and mortal humanity. In Arima, she keeps guard beneath the earth. Grim Echidna, the nymph who neither dies nor grows old through all her days. I had heard later when, most of the myth was over that Echidna died. But we can get to that later. This lion child of the two awful creatures, Typhon and Echidna, and where did Typhon and Echidna come from? Was Gaia and Tartarus in a physical being form got it on and gave birth to Typhon and Echidna. So they were brother and sister, got it on, and had all these monster children. So, Typhon and Echidna, who suckled and raised on the moon before falling from the bosom of Selene to make his home in Nemea. So that's the lion we're talking about, the Nemean lion. In the Peloponnese, not far from Mycenae, the town of Nemea was later famous for its games, which were seen in the same class as the Pythian, Delphic, and Olympic games for a temple of Zeus, parts of which still stand today. And, of course, for its lion. That the Argolid region, which included Nemea, should be afflicted by this monster was remarkable. The Argolid came under the special protection of Queen Hera. And yet, it was Hera who had unleashed the lion upon the very people whom she was meant to defend. Yeah, that's irony. So one suggestion is that Hera liked to bathe in a sacred spring near Argos every year, a process which renewed her virginity and so made her more fascinating to her oversexed spouse. Believing that she had been spied upon during a recent bathing excursion, Queen Hera had retaliated violently. Aha. So she's the one responsible for putting the lion there in the first place. The quick-tempered wife of Zeus set him, which is the Nemean lion, loose to damage Argos. So that's the end of the stitch from Hesiod. Anyways, the lion, like its Ciceronian counterpart, the first lion that Hercules killed, busily set about depopulating the flocks and herds in the area. No surprise. It also acquired the habit of abducting and killing young women. When local heroes set out to rescue each woman, the lion would lurk in the recesses of the cave pretending to be its victim. When the unsuspecting rescuers came within range, the lion would revert to its true shape and rend the hero's tooth and claw. So they're saying it was a shapeshifter. It would shapeshift into a human, then transform back into the Nemean lion and just kill any warrior. As a punishment to the people of Nemea, the lion was both painful and effective. No doubt delegations came to King Eurystheus, pointing out that, as taxpayers, the local people expected action from their ruler on this matter. So we can see why King Eurystheus made getting rid of the lion a priority. What is surprising was that Queen Hera let him do this. Now remember, Queen Hera kind of was invisible, hanging out with King Eurystheus and telling King, hey, make Hercules do this. Make Hercules do this for the next labor. But she didn't say nothing, and that was to be the first labor, was the Nemean lion. Since King Eurystheus was working hand in glove with the goddess, Hera, it is unlikely that he would have Hercules kill this lion without Hera's consent. But perhaps that consent had been given. After all, it was one thing to unleash a monster upon the countryside in a fit of pique. It was quite another thing for that monster to keep ravaging the land and making its protectors look bad. So even the king is like, dude, I'm looking bad in front of my own people with the Nemean lion killing wantonly, not just humans, but cattle, any livestock, the lion would just kill it and eat it. Since those protectors were King Eurystheus and patron goddess Hera, respectively, perhaps it was now time for the lion to go. Of course, there was no guarantee that Hercules would not fall at the first hurdle. Well, there was no guarantee of anything, really, not that early. So, instead of Hercules disposing of the lion might dispose of Hercules. In fact, that was the beauty of this first labor. However things worked out, the result would be a win for King Eurystheus and Queen Hera of the gods. The perfect outcome would be for one protagonist to be mortally wounded in the process of killing the other. Unlikely, but one can always hope. So, Hercules was sent on his way. In comparison to the later missions which took him over much of the known world and beyond, the trip to Nemea barely constituted a day's journey for Hercules. One day and he was there at that area. There was a mountain and caves. There was a series of caves that the lion kind of, lived in. His destination was nearby in the mountains, a narrow pass with a cave on the side. We have a stitch, Pausanias. The pass is called Trados, which means pierced. It is narrow, for the mountains press closer on all sides. Here, in these mountains, they still point out the cave of the famous lion. Some 15 stades, 2.3 kilometers, distant from Nemea itself. So, stitch is done, we get back into it. What happened next we can hear from Hercules himself, as he told it to a man called Phyleus. The tale was preserved by the poet Theocritus, who recorded it in his bucolic Idyls in the 3rd century BC. Alright, well, whatever. So, this Phyleus actually stitches in here, An Achaean came from Achaea, from Helix by the sea. He told me that he had witnessed the slaying of that creature, the Nemean lion, the dreadful scourge of the countryside, the monstrous lion which has its lair by the grove sacred to Zeus of Nemea. The slaying was done by an Argive, and I believe that man was yourself, for the lion skin draped over your sides confirms that this epic deed was done by your hand. Well, yeah, he had the pelt of said lion. You'd assume he's the guy. I am certain that so huge a monster would never be found in all of Apis, which supports only bears and boars. So tell of how this affliction came to well-watered Nemea, and how you slew it with your bare hands. So Hercules responded to Phyleus, "Since you ask, I could tell you everything about this monster apart from whence it came. For that matter, no Argive knows this, even though some make that claim. The best guess is that one of the sacred gods was angry with the sons of Phoreneus. So the scourge of the lion was unleashed, and like a river bursting into a valley, it devastated all in its path. The people of Bambiana suffered more of the pitiless onslaught than they could endure. So King Eurystheus laid on me this first labor to complete. I had to kill this ferocious beast." It continues, "So I set out, taking with me my supple bow and hollow quiver filled with arrows. When I arrived at the lion's hunting grounds, I took my bow, I fitted the string to the curved horns, and aligned it with my grief-bringing arrows. Then it was a matter of scouting for the accursed monster and locating him before he discovered me. I had neither sight of his tracks or sound of his roar, but still the pallor of fear hung over the farmsteads. It was the middle of the day, yet no man worked with his oxen or labored in the fields. There was no one who could give me directions. So without a pause I headed for the leafy mountainside and searched. When the lion was found, I would immediately test my strength on him." Okay, that stitch is done. Immediately did not happen that day, nor the next. For weeks, Hercules searched in vain. Weeks he searched, for it seemed he was fated to be exactly where the lion was not. Even though the lion was unaware of the hunter, time and again the whims of chance took him out of one side of the pass, just as Hercules entered from the other side. Then, after the lion had circled his hunting grounds, he would again enter the pass and his cave just as Hercules left via the other exit. This went on for almost a month, and the exasperated hero realized that it could continue indefinitely. So, as was his wont, he took drastic steps to change the situation. He had to. A few hours later, the narrow mountain pass was no more. A Hercules-induced rock slide had completely closed off one end of the pass. Again, with Hercules' strength, he could just throw and smash rocks as he pleased. So at the other end, our hero lurked in the bushes, with bow in hand and killing in mind. Now, Hercules takes up the tale again. Here comes the stitch of Hercules telling his tale. "It was late in the day when the lion returned to his lair. His tongue licked his chops, for he had feasted on meat and blood. The evidence was splattered all over his squalid mane, his glaring face, and his chest. On that woodland path, I had been waiting for him, hiding in the shadow of some bushes. Now, as he passed, I let loose a swift arrow at his flank and failed. I expected the arrow to run true between the ridges of the lion's ribs, but instead it bounced off and fell useless to the green grass. Again, that pelt, the skin of the lion, you just could not pierce. You couldn't stab through it or cut it. Astonished, the lion snarled wickedly through his teeth and raised his great head higher from the ground, searching all over with his keen gaze. Angry at wasting my first shot, I let a second loose from the string, and this time scored a hit right in the chest, at the very seat of the lungs. The arrow, which should have inflicted agony, hit the hide and then dropped between his paws, as useless as the one before. In furious disgust, I prepared to draw for the third time. But the rolling eyes of the monstrous beast had settled upon me, and the lion prepared himself for battle. His tail lashed his thighs, his throat swelled with fury, and anger bristled his tawny mane, raging to taste my flesh. He arched his spine like a bow, gathering his length between flanks and midriff. Then the terrible creature sprang from afar to right upon me in a moment. I had taken my cloak from my shoulders and folded it with the arrows in one hand, as a makeshift shield. In my other hand, I held my seasoned club with wild olive. That's what the club was made of. Now I swung that club back past my ears and smashed it down on his skull. Tough as it was, the wood splintered to pieces on the invincible monster's maned skull. But it dropped the brute before he could reach me, and he fell, landing on shaky feet and swinging his head from side to side to clear the darkness that rose behind his eyes from the stunning impact. But it wasn't dead. Seeing him stunned and confused with pain, I moved in quickly before he could regain his wits and his breath. Throwing bow and embroidered quiver to the ground, I grabbed the beast by the scruff of his iron neck. Then, with all the strength in my hands, I began to strangle him. Remember, Hercules is a master of wrestling, maybe one of the best ever. So he got him in a hold and started to choke in a wrestling hold, the best you can against a lion, but strangling the lion. It was necessary to do this from behind, lest his claws eviscerate my body. So I pinned his hind feet to the ground with my heels, while my knees squeezed his flanks. So we're in full wrestling mode at this point. Even though it's a lion, he had to do what he had to do. So then, with my hands around the lion's neck, I stretched the body out. Finally, it collapsed, asphyxiated into my arms, and Hades, lord of the underworld, received the lion's spirit. So, he killed it. Hercules had won. The stitches ended. We get back into it. Hercules had won. He had killed the lion. But he had not yet completed his labor. That labor was to bring to Eurystheus the skin of the mighty lion. And there, Hercules hit a problem. His arrows had bounced off the lion's hide because the lion had two remarkable attributes. Claws, which could rip through anything, hence Hercules' care to keep out of their way while he was wrestling and strangling the lion. How does one remove the pelt from a beast that can't be skinned? How do you do it? Because he already tried his own club. He already tried his own arrows. And nothing's cutting through that skin. So how do you prove? If the mission was to bring the pelt back, how do you do it? You already killed it, so that part's done. So this left Hercules with a conundrum. How does one remove the pelt from a beast that can't be skinned? First, Hercules tried with a knife, just to confirm what the arrows had already demonstrated. Making no impression with the blade, he tried sharpening the knife on a stone. Finally, he smashed the stone and tried cutting the hide with the sharp edges. When even that failed, our hero was stumped. He's like, how do I do this? Fortunately, Hercules was seldom alone in his labors. As usual, his half-sister, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, was watching over her protege. Half-sister and half-brother. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and Hercules, who is still mortal at this point. So, Athena was definitely the brains of the outfit. Well, she is the goddess of wisdom, so. The goddess gently pointed out to the perplexed hero that an impenetrable hide could not coexist in the same universe with claws which could rip through anything. Now that's interesting. Either the claws were an irresistible force or the hide was an immovable object. But when the lion's claws were applied to the lion's hide, something had to give. So, when the matter was put to the test, the claws won the day. Hercules finally had the means to slice through the monster's skin and remove the pelt. This he did with some care. It had occurred to him, or more probably it had occurred to Athena, who passed along the idea, that King Eurystheus had stipulated that Hercules must bring the lion's skin to him. This Hercules would do, and no more than that. Having brought the skin to Eurystheus, the labor was complete. After presenting the pelt for inspection, Hercules had no intention of giving it up. The hide was much more than a trophy to commemorate the successful completion of the first labor. Cut properly from its previous owner, the invulnerable lion skin could be fashioned into a cloak. Given the perils that lay in Hercules' future, more labors, a garment totally impervious to sharp objects was a very welcome addition to his wardrobe, as Hercules concludes. Here's a small stitch from Herc. There, my friend, you have that tale of the doom of the lion of Nemea, that creature which brought so many sorrows to flocks and to men. The stitch ended. Or ends. So we get back into it. This is not quite the end of the tale. On his way to confront the lion, Hercules had been the guest of a peasant farmer called Melorchus. The farmer was planning to sacrifice a ram to Zeus Soter, which means Zeus the Savior. So, King Zeus, king of the gods. Hercules, who's the son of Zeus, persuaded the man to wait for 30 days. If he returned within the period, the pair would sacrifice to Zeus together in thanks for his salvation. If Hercules failed to return, then Melorchus would sacrifice anyway. But this time to the spirit of the dead hero, which would be Hercules. The sacrifice was already prepared, and the ram about to be killed in Hercules' name, when the proposed honorand arrived in the nick of time. Though the sacrifice went ahead dedicated to Zeus, Hercules had a small funeral of his own to arrange. Through pride or stoicism, he had failed to mention to Phyleus that the strangulation of the lion had not gone as smoothly as might be wished. At some point, the beast had managed to chew off one of Hercules' fingers. Yeah, that's actually true. There's a stitch. Heracles had only 9 fingers after the Nemean lion had bitten off one. There exists a tomb for this detached finger. One can see it at Sparta. The stitch continues. There is a stone lion erected on the tomb to symbolize of the power of the hero. Thus began the tradition of placing stone lions on the tombs of distinguished people. Now that's kind of interesting. So, the Nemean lion has a memorial of his own, and one befitting so mighty a beast. From July to August, the lion rules the cosmos as the astrological sign of Leo. The constellation crouches in the sky between Cancer in the west and Virgo to the east. Perhaps the lion dreams of the distant future when the slow drift of the galaxy brings the constellation of Hercules within his reach, and the pair can square off for a celestial rematch. So that's going to do it, guys, for now. That's the first labor of Hercules. We are going to get into more of it, because the second is the second labor is the Lernaean Hydra, and there's a lot that goes into that, and who's actually in it beyond Hercules himself. So that's going to do it for now, and thank you for joining me, and we'll get into labor number 2, which is the Lernaean Hydra. Galacron out.